All right, you're now in charge. All right, just the way I like it.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we got maybe about another minute, maybe two, and then we'll get started. We're going to be in Ezra tonight, which always think it's funny. We look through, the kids' curriculum and you see like one class study the entire book of Ezra, or one class study the entire book of Revelation. Like,
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Picking up a few. Yeah. Well, we can get started, and everybody can join us as they come on board. But I'd say let's go if you guys are ready. Let's do it.
That's good.
Like I said just a minute ago, we're going to be in the book of Ezra, and if you join us most weeks, you'll see a different face this evening. Stuart Peck's joined us tonight, which we're excited about, and thanks, Stu, for making some time to jump on here with us. Stuart's a great Bible student. I love studying with him and talking about especially things like Bible history and those types of things. He's a great guy to talk to about that. And so I think he's going to be really helpful over the next few minutes as we take a look through the book of Ezra. So, Stu, we're going to start most of the time when guys join us, we put them on the spot right off the bat and ask them to do a little summary for us of what we're going to be studying this evening. So I know it may be difficult to summarize the entire book of Ezra. We're going to focus most of our time on the first few chapters here of the book of Ezra. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to put a fancy timer up on the screen, and we're going to give you 1 minute to tell us a little bit about what you know about the book of Ezra. How's that sound?
Oh, man. Okay. Well, I'll be honest, it's not the first book of the Bible that I go to when I'm doing my daily Bible readings or looking for that inspirational passage, but it's still a good book. And, right off the bat, we get into that history that you were talking about, because we see it mentioned in verse 1 that the things that Jeremiah had actually prophesied are coming to fruition. And of course, we know that the king of Persia, King Cyrus, he had just taken over. And one of the first things he does is he allows all of the captives to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, rebuild the city. And that's what really the whole first chapter is. It's the proclamation from Cyrus. And then as you get into chapter 2, it's one of those lovely sections of names, and this time names with the numbers of people with those names that go back to Jerusalem. And so that's a lot of chapter 2. And then as you go into it further, you start to see the rebuilding of the temple, and that comes with some hiccups as they start to see naysayers and enemies crop up who don't want them to rebuild the temple. So
right, and that I think you did a great job of setting the stage for what Ezra is all about. And of course, oftentimes we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah kind of together. At one point, they were combined as one scroll, one book. They've been separated since, but the story of the rebuilding of Jerusalem goes through those two books and begins here in Ezra as they've come back from Babylonian captivity. So, Jeremy, Stu mentioned that it kind of begins with this decree that Cyrus issues. Maybe tell us a little bit about that. What's been going on with the nation of Israel, and why is this decree, one, so important? And then why is it referred to here as a prophecy that's being fulfilled that Jeremiah had spoken about? Maybe fill in some of the blanks for us on that.
Yeah, we'll start with that. Stuart may mention already, the book of Jeremiah, where he spoke specifically about this time and that they would be in captivity. Jeremiah does, puts a specific number on it. And I think that becomes really important here for Ezra chapter 1. And that specific number is 70 years. That for 70 years, the people are going to be in captivity. And you can get those 70 years in a couple of different ways. I mean, even historically, you can get them, in a couple of different ways, whether you want to start from 606 BC or start from 586 BC, one when the first captives are gone, the second when Jerusalem is destroyed. Significant times is at the end of that 70 years. And what you see here happening is Cyrus, now king of Persia, is going about things very differently than we saw with Babylon. Certainly their captives. I've already talked about Daniel over, a couple of different weeks, and, Babylon they would take, places of captivity, and they would bring people to Babylon, to the city, to the nation, to the capital, like we saw specifically with Daniel. And Persia seems to go about it in a little bit different ways. They seemingly now are letting the people go back to where they came from. Not just that, rebuild their cities, rebuild their places of worship. Now, certainly there's going to be payments, and there's going to be taxes, and there's going to be, still with them standing on their heads, if you will. But it's just a very different way to go about it. And so you see now the people allowing themselves to go back. And even though we're in the book of Ezra, I'm sure you'll bring this up, Ezra himself doesn't show up until like chapter 7 of the book. Right. This is really making mention of the first people that go back. And there are really 3 different waves that go, one with Zerubbabel, one with Ezra, one with Nehemiah. And this is really the first wave of people. And to make a big, huge circle back to your question, I guess, about Jeremiah, it is that prophecy. It was just to be a very short time in captivity. And now we see the fruition of that. The people are going back to Jerusalem. And they're going to rebuild the city. They'll rebuild the temple in Ezra. They'll rebuild the walls in Nehemiah, and the people will be back in Jerusalem.
When I was thinking about this earlier today, one of the things that always is important for me to remember, because it's easy to overlook sometimes, is to remember these people are going back to nothing. I mean, when we think about what happened to the city of Jerusalem when Babylon conquered it, I mean, they burned the place to the ground, and more or less outside of some inhabitants, I mean, it's remained that way for the last 70 years. And we think about this great triumphant return that the people of Israel were able to go back to Jerusalem and kind of rebuild the city. And certainly that was a great moment in their history, but they were going back to nothing. And I think that is even kind of showcased a little bit just by the fact that a lot of the Jews were like, no thanks, I'm going to stay right here in Babylon. Or, I'm not really interested in going back. And for a lot of them, I mean, at this point, they'd been born and raised in Babylon. That was their home. They didn't know Jerusalem or anything like that. And so as I was reading that just came to mind again, just how significant of an ask it is for these people to go back to this rubble and try and rebuild it. But that's what they're tasked with. That's the opportunity that's been given to them. And so, Stu, when you were reading this today, thinking about that and thinking about the task at hand, I mean, what do you think must have been going through the minds of these people as, okay, there's some freedom that comes with this. There's some excitement that comes with this. There's also a whole lot of work and a whole lot of headache that comes with this. I mean, what must be going through the minds of some of these people as they return to Jerusalem and see what it is at this point in time?
Yeah, and I was reading today that they think about 50,000 people eventually returned to Jerusalem. So, like you said, it's not everybody that went into captivity, and that kind of made me think. It's like, wow, they were comfortable in Babylon. they'd gotten used to that lifestyle. And so, yeah, they were like, yeah, I can take it or leave it. The people who did go back, as you mentioned, some of them were probably people who never ever saw Jerusalem in the first place. They were born in captivity, and now they're going back with their parents. Maybe they're going back on their own because they just know that that's where they're supposed to be. And for a culture that is so centered around their temple, to walk into Jerusalem and see a pile of rubble, literally, where the temple once stood, it would have to be a little bit bittersweet, because yes, they're home, but then they're also seeing what it used to be, and maybe some horrible memories are rushing back, but they got to work. So
we do get that impression a couple of different times, both in Nehemiah and Ezra. Certainly in Ezra, when the temple's completed, there is both excitement, but there's also mourning that takes place, because there are some there, while few, there are some there who probably had seen the glory of Solomon's temple, and what was rebuilt was nothing like that. And so there are some mixed emotions, and certainly it comes with the walls as well. Just seeing what was left of their city, those who had been around, those who were older and were coming back. I'm sure there's some very mixed emotions with all of this. Yes, it's a homecoming in one regard, but it's very depressing in another. And I imagine that was very difficult for some of them. Jeremy, when we continue on a little bit in the story and we start to get into the work that Stu mentioned just a moment ago, as they begin the work on the temple, one of the things that stands out and is a continual problem throughout Ezra and into Nehemiah is that while they've been sent back and while they have the opportunity to rebuild the temple and their houses and stuff like that, because there are no walls, it leaves them very exposed. And that's going to create some problems for them. And so maybe speak to that a little bit. Certainly there are some challenges presented just with getting the people motivated to do this work. But then there's also very real physical problems that stand in their way because of the fact that they're so exposed and unprepared to deal with any conflict. And that plays a significant role in this story too.
Yeah, I think one of the really most interesting things that would have made it a challenge for them, lots of things. This would be even outside of from the outside, people causing problems in the region, but just within themselves. And we talked about it already, here, and I continue to go back to it, that although Jerusalem is something that these people have certainly, they know about and they've heard about, they're familiar with its significance, maybe in the words of the significance. Mm-hmm. But I think it's something to really consider, the fact that you're dealing with people that just haven't been there. I mean, it's not just that, I remember it when it used to be. I mean, if that was the case, you may have a few of the really elderly, that's the case. But listen, Ezra and Nehemiah, they come decades after this. Yeah. When Ezra and Nehemiah are on the scene, you're nobody has seen Jerusalem, up to this point. I mean, maybe with this first group, I mean, you may have super elderly people but I'm outside of that. So it's going to not feel very home-like. Mm-hmm. And then to have the motivation to rebuild something that doesn't feel very home-like, but really only is to hold that spiritual significance. And listen, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah showcases that they had some spiritual restoration that needed to take place first. And it really wasn't until a lot of that happens that they start to make this place feel like home again. And just, the inward motivation to go to work in the face of those obstacles, where it's not any place you're super familiar with. Individually, you're not familiar with it, just would have been a huge, huge obstacle, I think, for these people.
Well, and Stu, don't you think, as these people came back, and, we see the opposition that confronts them pretty early on as they begin this process. And that obviously throws a wrench in all of this. But if they're already struggling with that motivation that Jeremy was describing, they're already struggling with seeing the value of rebuilding the temple. Again, they've grown up without a temple. they've grown up outside of Jerusalem. If you're already struggling with some of that, I think it's obvious and clear how easily an opposition like this could throw you off track because you're not fully invested in the project at hand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's some application to draw from that. Maybe we can talk about that for just a minute, because all of us at different times in our lives, we're going to face opposition of different kinds when it comes to our spiritual walk. And if we're not fully invested, it's not going to take much to derail us. And how do we guard against that? How do we protect ourselves from being so easily derailed and falling into the trap that I think we see some of the Jews falling into here in the early parts of Ezra?
Yeah, I mean, in chapter 4, we see that these adversaries pop up. And one of the things that's interesting is, they don't go into the city and just try and kill the people and take it over. They actually send a letter to the next king that's in power and say, hey, I don't know if you know what's happening here, but these guys are rebuilding the city. And let me tell you about their past a little bit. So they dig into Israel's past and say, you may not want them rebuilding the city. And so I think that would be really deflating for somebody like me, who's like, whoa, I wasn't part of that back there, but I'm taking it personally. And I think that we see that in the world today is, our adversaries take opportunity to dig up any dirt that they might be able to find on us or the church or Christianity or whatever you want to say, and use that against us to divide us and to separate us, because we all know that it's going to take every person to rebuild the city. And if they can divide them, and if they can just really make them feel like, man, is this even worth doing? Get in their heads mentally that they're not going to do it.
Yeah. Jeremy, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, one thing that, Stuart just said is what helps us to get through difficulties. I mean, listen, we can spend, a long time talking about, the countless difficulties that we have coming from the outside, but even the ones that we build within ourselves, like, that they would have had, here, and we have as well. But one thing that really helps to combat, I think, both sides of that, whether it's difficulties come from the outside or difficulties coming from within, is just having other people around you kind of on the same page. And, you get to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, both, they are such unity forward books. I mean, it's a big part of, chapter 2 is a long kind of drawn out with a lot of names, given to us. But the point is, here are all of the people that were working together. I underlined and made a note of 3 different verses just in chapter 3, 3 different times in chapter 3. Listen to what verse 1, verse 9, and verse 11. In verse 1, it says, when the 7th month had came and the children of Israel were in the cities, the people gathered together as one man in Jerusalem. I mean, what an incredible picture that is. Look at verse 9. Jeshua with his sons and brothers, Kadmiel with his sons and brothers, the sons of Judah, arose as one to oversee those working on the house of God. And so you have again that. And then verse 11, and they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. And then all the people shouted with a great shout, and they praised the Lord because, the foundation, has been laid. And you get these incredible pictures of really them working together. And you get that throughout the book of Ezra. You get that throughout the book of Nehemiah. And that's what it took then, but it is still what it takes today. I mean, for me to get through all of the adversarial things, whether it's from the outside or something I concoct in my own heart,
yeah.
I need help to get through those things. And that's what God has done. He's provided it. He's provided help. He's provided help that I get from you 2 guys here and many, many others. And we've got to be able to see the importance of that unified front with God's people. And it is front and center in this book for sure.
Yeah. And I'll add to that, when talking about that unified front, it's important to have godly leadership at the front of that unified front.
Yeah.
That you and I have talked about that, it seems like several times over the past few months as we've done this study. But, Ezra and Nehemiah, I mean, they're an instruction manual for godly leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, these two books describe the importance of godly leadership perhaps better than any other place in the Bible you'll find. Without that leadership in place, the temple wouldn't have been rebuilt, the walls wouldn't have been rebuilt. I mean, Ezra does some really difficult things at the end of this book as he tries to lead the people back to a right relationship with God. And it's so important, I think, when we're facing difficult circumstances, when we're facing opposition, that there are godly people in our lives who we trust, who we know to be wise and more experienced than we are, that we can look to for help. And not that they're going to be perfect, not that they're never going to mess up, but we trust them and we know that they have our best interest at heart. And that just can't be overstated how important that is. And I think these two books highlight that on a level that few do, just how important that godly leadership is when it comes to that. Stu, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I would say, going back to Jeremy's point, that one thing that Satan really tries to do to us, he tries to make it a mental game. He tries to isolate us, and he makes us want to think that it's too big to overcome. It would be easy for these Israelites to look at this project and say, this is too big to overcome, and then heap on naysayers and go, man, there's no way we can do this. And he gets in our heads. And I'll say to your point, John, that Ezra is such an amazing person, because, like you said, he's a leader, but he's not your normal typical leader. I mean, he's not even really a prophet, he's a scribe. And so he's just a guy that is really passionate about making sure that God is followed and that his law is followed. And we see that throughout Ezra, is that he is working to follow God's law. And that's what I think every good leader today needs to be doing.
Well, and that's something that comes up certainly as you go throughout Ezra and then into Nehemiah as well. When the law is read to the people, I mean, Ezra's right there. He's playing an important role in all of that as they try and really restore not just the structure of religion, so to speak, but a true relationship between God and his people. He's at the forefront of that as they read the law and they begin to make some of the changes that are required of them. And all of that certainly speaks to that requirement for godly leadership in our lives. And then it also speaks to what we've been talking about already, just the difficulty that these people faced from where they were to where God wanted them to be. They had so far to go and they had so many obstacles to overcome. And, there are times we can see in both of these books, there are times where their resiliency waned a little bit and it became a challenge for them. And that's where we need each other, as Jeremy was pointing out. That's where we need godly leadership to really help get us over the edge and continue on in that work. And these books are a great example for us, but I think it's just such a practical application that we can pull from these.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you think about Ezra especially, and Nehemiah as well. I mean, you see this in some of the other books, even like Isaiah and like Jeremiah. There's so much good that can come from those books today, even more so than just, the practical applications that we get, or even, the knowledge and the information we get from, about God and who he is and his interaction with his people. I mean, you study a book like Ezra and a book like Nehemiah. I mean, we're at the very back end of the Old Testament story. Even though those books aren't at the back end of the Old Testament, we're still very much at the back end of the Old Testament story. But even Daniel is this way. These are history books in a lot of ways. And what really stands out to me, and especially we've just finished with Daniel, very specific people, non-Jewish people are made mention of, that you can go and find in history. And the same is happening already here in Ezra. We've made mention of Cyrus. We've made mention of Artaxerxes. You see it again, certainly in the book of Daniel. You see it, in the book of Nehemiah. And now you have, I mean, it's not difficult to go and look up the history, in these places. And so what a study of a book like Ezra. And I mean, we are scratching the surface in a half hour, on a study of the book of Ezra. But I mean, what something else that comes from that is this is a real deal thing that took place right here. And it's not hard to find out who Cyrus was, or who Artaxerxes was, or who Persia, what that kingdom was. It's not hard to find out those things. And it continues to build, our faith in so many different ways. When you open a book like Ezra and you see and you learn and you see the history and you see the application and everything, from it. And it's an incredible book. And I almost, I feel silly trying to cover it in a half hour almost, a little bit, but there's so much, good that could come out, from it. We've got, 8 minutes left. And I wanted to, fit that in because it's just so faith building. Because even the history that you find in the book, I gave all kinds of, those are historical numbers when we talk about, Jerusalem being destroyed in 586 and the Israelites being carried away in 606. And those are all historical numbers, that can be tracked pretty easily. Those aren't just things that we've tossed out there. And when I made mention of the 70 years of Jeremiah, those aren't just arbitrarily numbers that you can math that out. Down into a pretty specific kind of way. And it's just, it goes to the greatness of God and the fact that, all of these things took place.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. The history behind all of this is fascinating. And it is important because it does kind of structure much of the latter half of the Old Testament for us.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Even set the stage for the New Testament. I mean, it's extremely important. We were texting earlier, and Stu, you made mention of the Cyrus cylinder and kind of the role that plays in solidifying some of the history behind this. I know that's something that comes up a lot when studying Ezra and Nehemiah, is that particular historical, I guess it's kind of a document, it's a cylinder. Yeah. But I mean, maybe tell us a little bit about that and how that comes into play in helping us understand the history behind this particular book.
So I mean, it was actually discovered in Iraq in the late 1800s. So it was like a cylinder, hence the Cyrus cylinder, but like the size of like a football. Jeremy was saying it's not that big. Jeremy's actually seen it in the British Museum, but it actually documents pretty much Ezra chapter 1, the decree that went out once Cyrus took over as king, that, hey, all of the people that are in captivity, not just Jews, but all of the people, go back to your land and rebuild your temples and your cult sites. And so to see, and this was discovered in the ground in Iraq, and to see how that fits so perfectly with what is said in Ezra, I think it helps make a three-dimensional picture of the Bible. And like you guys were saying, it really helps to add to the validity of what we read in these books of the Bible.
Jeremy, he mentioned you've seen it. I think have you shown pictures of that in a sermon or two or something like that?
Maybe. It's been a while since we've been over there, but certainly I mentioned it's in the British Museum. So I mean, it's very accessible. It's very easy to get to. I mean, you got to go to London to get to it, but it's got a pretty prominent place, in the area that it is. It's not real big. You can't read it. It's in a language that I don't know, but they do have, the translation, next to it. And it is. And again, what that does is it adds validity to what we see. I mean, the book of Ezra is writing about something that took place, thousands of years ago. And here's something that came out of the ground that is that old, but just, 100, 200 years ago. And so now the story, it coincides with history. Mm-hmm. And there's no contradiction, in it in any way. And just to be able to see those things, or, if you ever have opportunity, I know Stuart has been, in Israel several times, and now you're looking at physical places that you can go and see, or even physical things that you can, see, like I have done. I mean, they're out there, and it's pretty readily that you can get to them. With a long plane flight, you can take over there. But also the advent of the internet really brings those things to life. I mean, you want to read up some more about the Cyrus cylinder, it is a very quick Google search, and you can learn everything you could ever want to learn and see every picture from every angle ever taken of it, probably, that you could find. And so the internet helps with those things. You don't have to travel halfway across the world to see it, although it's there. I mean, it's right here at your fingertips on the internet as well.
But it is, it's always interesting to kind of see the historical artifacts that have been uncovered that solidify, what we read in Scripture. And by no means should we have to have those things in order for our faith to be built upon, but it is very fascinating and even encouraging when those types of things are found and made known. And it lines up so well, like Stu was saying, with what we read here in Ezra, that yeah, these events really happened. Like the people of Israel really went back to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they rebuilt the temple, and they rebuilt eventually the walls that surrounded the city. And again, it sets the stage for what's going to come in the New Testament. And when Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed, there is some connection point, even though those people wouldn't have been a part of this, certainly, because it would have been hundreds of years prior. They know their nation's history, and there's a connection point to all of that. And so it really sets the stage for what's going to come in the New Testament. And so the history is interesting, but it's also important to the biblical narrative. I think to be able to follow those things, both the chronology of it as well as the history of it, because it really brings to life the rest of Scripture for us. So, Stu, before we stop, we've just got a few minutes left here before we're going to stop tonight. But as you read through the book of Ezra today, I know you've studied the book of Nehemiah as well a lot. When you think about what takes place in the building of the temple, the building of the walls, all the opposition that goes into that, all the struggles that the people of Israel went through over this time period of, whatever, 60, 70, 80 years or something like that. When you think about the application that we can take away from this, we've talked about the application as it refers to the opposition we face sometimes in our lives. But think maybe just for a moment about the work that's completed and what's accomplished by these people, these untrained, relatively few in number, the accomplishments that they were able to do through the help of God, through the help of godly leadership. Think about the application we can take from that today as his people working in our communities, working in the Lord's church. What type of encouragement, what type of application can we take from that?
Well, I think one of the things that I found really encouraging was when this decree came out from Cyrus, he wasn't forcing them out the door. They had a choice, and some of them decided to go. And I think God will, for us, make a way for people who try to work for him and do the hard work. Yeah. I mean, this was a hard job, but all along the way, God made a way for them. And I think he's going to do that for us today if we truly are ready to roll up our sleeves and get to work in his kingdom. And look, there are people who do that, and there are people who don't do that. And I think that it's inspiring and encouraging to see stories like this where some people said, you know what, this job needs to get done. Yeah. And God said, look, I'm going to use Cyrus to help you get it done. I'm going to use governors who are speaking out against me. They're going to give you tax money because, that's what they're going to have to do. But I think that's a huge application for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeremy, with last word.
Well, I mean, it's just, just to piggyback there on what, Stuart just said. I mean, God is looking for us to succeed, and he provides to us everything that we need in order to do it. I just have to take that and get to work. And that's what you see in the book of Ezra. And that's what you see in the book of Nehemiah is you see these people together. We've talked about that, just getting to work, and spectacular things take place. I mean, spectacular things with the foundation being laid, with the temple being built, with the walls being built in the way that they are in the book of Nehemiah. It's just, you can almost look at it and say, well, that doesn't even make sense that they were able to complete all of those things. Yeah. Well, it does, because God is there with them. Right. And that is the same kind of things that can happen when his people are working together today. Spectacular things can take place if we're working together in the direction, certainly, that God, has us pointed in.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, we'll stop there. That was a quick 30 minutes, but a good one. And thanks, Stu, for taking some time to join us. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
A lot of fun. Always good talking to you guys about this stuff. So thank you all for watching and joining us in our conversation. And we will do it again next Tuesday night.